Hi, class. This is part two to stage two of the Spanish colonial era. And as I mentioned before, I'm breaking this chapter up into two segments. I think it's a little bit more digestible this way. Okay, so let's get into the second part of this chapter. As you know, Vigil, the author of our textbook, has the five C's, and one of them is culture. And so in this chapter, he kind of delves into this Hispanicization and mestizaje. Mestizaje, literally, quite literally, is the mixing of the Spanish translation is the mixture. And so in this case, well, what are we mixing? We're mixing indigenous cultures with Spanish and producing something new. The transformation of Indian culture life during this period varied across regions of Mexico. Um, and what that means is this, we seem to think that the Spaniards were everywhere consistently in Mexico, and that really wasn't the case. And so you had different reactions and responses to the Spaniard expansion. And this depended on the intensity and duration of the Spaniards' presence. And while you had many natives that assimilated and acculturated to the emerging dominant culture, other groups of people wanted to remain Indian. They wanted to remain in their own um, indigenous culture. And how they did that was they sought out refuge away from the Spaniards. They escaped to the mountains and the valleys and the hinterlands, and in the process um, had less exposure and therefore did not embrace that acculturation and assimilation process quite like the groups that might have stayed, for example, in the urban settings. Um, Vigil introduces this notion of syncretic development. It's two distinct kinds of cultural matrix produced by a blending, a cultural blending, mestizaje. And he goes into how this particular blending was prevalent in diet, in medicine, and in health practices. For example, maize, beans, squash, chile. Remember those indigenous or native plants that were domesticated by Mexicans and by the Mexica. Well, they gave way to what the Spaniards were used to in their particular homeland: wheat, rice, etc. Distilled liquor, whereas the indigenous groups had pulque, that particular drink that's from agave. The Spaniards, wanted something a little bit more refined and distilled. And so you had mezcal, and slowly mezcal gave way to tequila. Ailments, ancient ailments, susto, malojo. These and others were cured with a mixture of old practices with modern knowledge and medicine. And these folks that kind of bridged these two camps. Um, we know them as curanderos, and these folks, they persist today. For example, susto. I know that, for example, let's say a small kid, a child gets scared by, I don't know, maybe someone playing a practical joke, or maybe they thought they saw something, and they have the jitters, and the baby's fussy and what have you. And so you would call in a curandero to kind of sweep away the susto, sweep away the fear, the 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 the, the scaredness, if you will, of what happened. And there's a whole ritual. I've not seen it, but I've heard of it. You use a broom and and all this, maybe some sage smoke, etc. Malojo is quite literally the evil eye. And we joke around, like for example, let's say you're eating ice cream, and I'm giving it the malojo there, wishing I had it, and all of a sudden it just falls out of your hand and plops on the floor. You know, I can joke, I gave it malojo. I wanted it, you wanted it, no one has it now. And so, and actually seen this with some folks that they don't want to give a small child, an infant or a toddler, malojo. So you'll see them, they'll admire a little baby, and they'll go up to the baby and somehow touch that baby, thinking that by touching them, you don't pass on that malojo. Um, my grandfather was a curandero, and I know he would use a lot of herbs and plants and what have you to fix toothaches and earaches and coughs and uh, ailments, stomach aches and all these interesting kind of you know, kid ailments that he would attend to. And then the last thing on the list is this creation called adobe, um, where you mixed it so that it would produce red tiles. Red tiles are reminiscent of Spain. So the Spaniards, if you think about a house with a red tile, you think it is a Mediterranean home or Spanish home style, and they kind of worked it so that they could produce these red tile roofs. Again, this blending of different cultures. Now, the indigenous groups had to adopt this new way of life, and 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 um, and it wasn't easy for them. I mean, if you want to be empathetic and think about it, if you're a religious person and you had to give up your religion and adopt a whole new way of thinking, um, that's what you had. This whole populace, this whole country had to undergo, and so they had to figure out ways to do this to make this transition a little bit easier. Um, the populace fashioned a new way of adopting the changes, and one of them was this notion of compadrasco, compadres. Um, for those of you that may not be, know that the Catholic tradition is when there's a process of baptizing a baby, a newborn. You go to the church, there's a ceremony, but you also need to enlist a help of another couple, the godparents. And the idea is if something should happen to the parents, the kids would go to the godparents. Now, interesting thing happened in this situation. This act of baptizing someone's kid um, elevates this relationship between just friends or acquaintances. Now they're compadres. It's a very heightened kind of celebrated status that those godparents have. And Vigil is capital is kind of drawing the conclusion that this wouldn't have been possible without this Capuli network that it replaced. In other words, when you had non-familial members as part of this network, this Capuli, now you have godparents, and it's kind of it's based on this notion that um, of a network, if you will. Extended families is kind of related to extended or families rather, is extended families. Now, whereas today we might have, we live in let's just say a typical two-parent, two-kid household, or maybe a single-parent household with a couple of kids, or what have you, or you're single. Well, in those days, the grandparents lived with the families, and by the nature of their age and their wisdom, they had a level of authority with in that household, and so that gave them kind of this exalted status, and I imagine Vihil's argument is that it also helped in the process of changing over. The last point here is gatherings on patron saints day, um, with fanfare and celebration. Now, if you recall, when we were studying the civilizations that were here, pre-Columbian civilizations, they had such thing as celebrations and festivals and what have you, but they weren't based on um, saints, and so they were based on occurrences, natural occurrences. They were based on the gods, if you will. And so Catholicism kind of took advantage of that. So, well, listen, you're still gonna have celebrations, but now it's going to be over a patron saint. A patron saint is the patron saint. How do I say this? Is maybe the saint that's adopted for that particular community. This saint will take care of you. Saint Mark. Here we are, at Palomar College in San Marcos, Saint Mark's, quite literally. And so the patron saint is what? Saint Mark. And so, maybe at the Catholic Church, St. Mark's, they do practice a celebration once a year in June, where you have the community come in and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of the same practice. It helped transition these indigenous populations into the Spanish societal fold. Um, Religion provided a gateway to cultural merging. It allowed the religious leaders to integrate Indian elements in successful transition from paganism. So that's what we kind of just talked about right now about the patron saints. Whereas the indigenous groups worship uh, native icons and spiritual imagery. Um, these deities were replaced by saints. Um, Pagan sites were converted to Christian use. This is a real interesting kind of side note here. I got the chance to visit Puebla and Cholula, which is a city right next to Puebla, south of Mexico City. And their fame is that they have 365 churches in between those two cities. And you think, wow, a lot of Christianity going on there. Well, yes and no. Um, what those Most of those actually were churches that were built over pagan sites. In other words, Aztec temples um, that they demolished, and from the rubble they constructed these churches on top of them. And so you know the Aztec in this case had those different sites, and they had to build all those churches on top of them to kind of help in that conversion process. The missionaries, the priests, and what have you, they played a critical role in this because you know they were the emissaries of the church. They were trying to convert these indigenous people, these Indians, and in that process of teaching respect for authority, they really pushed this notion of heaven and hell. If you are dutiful and obedient, you get to go to heaven. But if you're disobedient and you're rebellious, guess where you go? Straight to hell. So before that, you know, there was not this notion of heaven and hell. It was more like death and life are the two faces on the same coin. You know, on each side of the coin, you have both these constructs, and it wasn't good or bad. It just was. Um, so, you know, these practices of baptism, rituals, ceremonies, prayers, fasting, confession, they weren't new for the indigenous groups. They had their own version of it. So when the Catholics came in and kind of started imposing their particular rituals along the same kind of lines, it was very easy for them to, the indigenous groups to adopt. Now, there was problems in this process of adaptation. You had disease. I think the one that usually stands out for most folks is smallpox. That's a very horrible disease. And just like you know the indigenous populations in which is now the United States, you had it spread by blankets or clothing or what have you. And the reason they were so susceptible is that these indigenous cultures didn't have any exposure to these European diseases, and so they fell quite ill rapidly, and it pretty much killed off large tracts of indigenous groups. So much so that the populations would dwindle. And when you had this economic structure built on these workers, all of a sudden now you didn't have these workers, and the survivors were forced to work harder and longer so that the level of tribute would not fall. So it was kind of a, I don't know, maybe a catch 22, if you will. This patron or patron peon complex that was formed because of this, you know, the haciendas and this whole economic structure really enforced this rule of etiquette that that established the guidelines, the rules, the relationship between a dominant subdominant um, groups of people. So you know the owners versus the workers, the patrones, the peons. Um, and I can't help but think that some of those remnants of that relationship are with us today. Um, I'll give you an example. In my household, when I was a kid, my parents would be, you know, calling for me in the other room, and I can remember distinctly saying, "Mande usted." You know, what is it that you command? What is it that you would like? And and you know, you think at first it's just a form of respect, but I think there's other ways to respond in a respectful fashion. And I can't help but think that that particular utterance, "mande usted," is from this patron peon era, where you know if I'm the patron, if I'm the owner of this hacienda, that's how I want you to respond to me. You are at my beck and call, and you confirm that every time when I call you out for you, and you say "mande usted." That's how you respond. I don't know. That's just a particular observation there. All right. Education, a double standard. Since Indians and mestizos were relegated to menial labor, there was no need for them to learn Spanish. Matter of fact, learning the Spanish language was a very guarded process. And so you had the missionaries and these other types that were overseeing the education of these indigenous people, these Indians. And they couldn't help but notice some of these Indians were brighter than others, just like, today we have bright students, we have students that can be brighter. And so they gave special attention to these standout students, and these are the ones they um, had them become priests, and because then they could teach others, they could instruct others. Um, Now, Spanish policy also required an unlimited number of manual workers because think of back to those days again. They're mining. There's the workers for the timber. There's workers for the crafts and just producing this wealth. And so you couldn't have too many educated folk because otherwise who would be doing the work? You can't have too many. Can't have all queen bees. You got to have worker bees. And so this notion that knowledge was very powerful. You don't want to give these Indians too much education. That's too dangerous. And so you had to have them. You had to thwart. You had to kind of curtail. You had to limit their intellectual development. And instead, you wanted them to focus on craft training. I have another observation on that, but I think I'll have to save that for another day. All right. What else? Let's see here. Native reactions and resultant problems. Native resistance for self-determination and cultural survival. Some fought and rebelled for independence, and again, like we talked about, they retreated to unsettled regions. They wanted to get away from that whole mess. And I think from this other byproduct of this reaction and this counter reaction was this notion of machismo, that it was equated with physical and social power. um, men men had the obligation to defend the honor of females from the Spanish. If left to their own devices, the Spaniards just have their way with the women folk there. And so these indigenous people fought back and said, "No, listen, you have to defend the honor of these females. You have to fight, but you also have to be hardworking, but you have to be a protector of home and family." So I know the word machismo has a different connotation now. It means quite literally more chauvinistic, but in that time, um, and even from hearing from my father and my grandparents, being a macho was a good thing. It was a person of his honor, physical strength, hard worker, defender of his home. And now it just means antiquated, chauvinistic um, kind of values. So again, that would have been a good discussion to get into in a live class with you all. Interestingly enough, I guess with the introduction of pulque and mezcal and tequila, drinking was used as an escape, kind of like what we do today, right? Um, and well, when you're drunk and have had one too many, you start fighting. Well, you start fighting, you get a bad rap, and pretty soon, those darn Indians are at it again, fighting each other, drunk. Um, so that the reaction of the populace to kind of in reaction to this brutal form of life, short, brutal, hard life, was to escape. And again, think back to the way it was before the Spaniards. They had kind of their own destiny in their own hands. They're autonomous. They lived in a society that honored or respected their work. And now they were just a cog in this particular machinery, expendable. And so they acted out that way. Um, Interesting notion. So you would have this if you were a good Indian, you were kind of elevated on the social ladder, up a notch or two or three on this ladder, the social ladder, and this manipulation um, created this rise of envidia. Envidia, the way I know it, it's kind of like this envious or jealousy that you have for your fellow classmate or your fellow neighbor, your fellow your coworker. And I've heard people talk about this, and the way they frame it is kind of like this. Is like, oh, those, it's a stereotype. Those Latinos, they're like crabs in a bucket. One starts to get out, and the other ones bring him down. And I think that particular analogy dates back to this notion of envidia, and somehow aspiring to ascend on the social ladder, attain this measure of social mobility, meant that you were turning your back on the people that you were with. Um, Anyways, all right, folks, that's it for me. Um, Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you soon.